Welcome back to our channel. In 1983, the United States found itself in a period of economic recovery and industrial transition. The nation was slowly emerging from the shadows of a recent recession, and the minting of currency continued with unwavering rhythm. Among the coins that flowed from the presses that year was the Washington quarter, struck in copper-nickel-clad composition and carrying the enduring image of George Washington on the obverse. Millions of these quarters poured out from the Philadelphia and Denver mints, destined for pockets, vending machines, and grocery store registers across the country. Yet somewhere in that immense stream of production, a few quarters emerged with a subtle but astonishing imperfection, one that would not be noticed by the general public, but which would ignite the interest of collectors years down the line. The 1983 quarters were not produced for collector sets. In fact, due to budget restrictions and shifting production strategies, no official mint sets were offered to the public that year. This decision would have unforeseen consequences, as it significantly limited the number of pristine, uncirculated examples that collectors could acquire directly from the mint. Most 1983 quarters entered circulation immediately, making high-grade examples extremely difficult to find decades later. But there was more than just scarcity at play. A batch of quarters struck in Philadelphia during that year carried an error so subtle it could slip by unnoticed under casual observation. The coin's obverse looked ordinary: Washington's familiar profile, "Liberty, in God we trust," and the date, 1983, were all perfectly intact. But it was on the reverse, the proud eagle with wings spread wide, that something went unexpectedly wrong. Upon closer inspection, the details on some of these coins were strangely incomplete. The feathers on the eagle's wings, the text, the inner rim, all appeared weak, soft, and nearly vanished in some areas. It was an error known as a "struck on a misaligned planchet" or incomplete reverse strike, though others attributed it to excessive die polishing or grease-filled dies. What truly mattered to collectors was the appearance. The coins looked partially melted or unfinished on one side, with faded legends and ghost-like devices. But what set them apart was not only the odd reverse, it was the bold clarity of the obverse. The duality of sharp and soft, clean and obscure, raised questions about how such an error could pass unnoticed during quality control at the mint. Mark Benson, a regional coin dealer with a taste for the obscure, first spotted one of these errors in a batch of circulated quarters he had purchased from a local bank. He thought the coin looked strange but assumed it had been worn down from use. Still, something about the lack of wear on Washington's profile didn't add up. Why would one side remain crisp while the other was nearly featureless? He held on to it, uncertain. Months later, during a coin show in Pennsylvania, he showed the quarter to a grading expert, who paused, examined it under magnification, and quietly muttered that this wasn't wear, it was an error. A real one. That interaction ignited a hunt. Mark began combing through 1983 quarters whenever he could find them, purchasing rolls from banks and asking fellow dealers to do the same. He found 3 more with the same ghosted reverse, each with small differences, but all exhibiting that telltale sign, a missing level of detail on the eagle's wings and surrounding text, paired with a perfectly struck obverse. It was clear now that this was not an isolated case. Word began to spread within the numismatic community. Articles were written, photographs shared, and collectors began searching their change with renewed purpose. The scarcity of 1983 mint sets made the hunt even more thrilling. There were no uncirculated supplies to fall back on, no sealed collections from the mint to dissect. Every discovery had to come from the wild, from the very change that had passed through hundreds of hands. As awareness of the error grew, so did its perceived value. Coin grading services began recognizing the unique features, attributing them accordingly and assigning the highest premiums to coins in mint state with the clearest examples of the anomaly. Some were labeled with designations like "reverse weak strike," while others were simply referred to as major mint errors. Regardless of the label, one thing was certain: these coins stood far apart from their normal 1983 counterparts. Then came an unexpected twist. A few coins surfaced that weren't just weakly struck, they were struck on entirely different planchets. One particularly astonishing example turned out to have been struck on a copper planchet intended for a 1-cent coin. Another, even more dramatic, appeared to be struck on a foreign planchet, smaller and thinner than the standard quarter. These extraordinary finds sent shockwaves through the collecting world, transforming a relatively obscure error into a wide-reaching phenomenon tied to a variety of unexplained anomalies from that same year, 1983. Some speculated that equipment changes or production pressures in the Philadelphia Mint that year may have resulted in lapses in quality control. Others believed that leftover planchets from prior coinage programs had been accidentally fed into presses during high-volume production shifts. Whatever the cause, the result was a moment in minting history where errors slipped through, not from negligence, but from the sheer force of human and mechanical limitation. Collectors now refer to 1983 as one of the most compelling years for modern quarters, not for what was supposed to happen, but for what went wrong. The lack of official mint sets, the abundance of circulation, the presence of rare errors, and the mystery surrounding misstruck planchets have created a perfect storm of desirability. And while many 1983 quarters still circulate today, the rare few bearing this error have become elite trophies for those who can identify them. Today, a 1983 U.S. Washington quarter with the weak reverse error, especially one in exceptional condition or on a rare planchet, can fetch anywhere between $40,000 and $108,000, elevating a humble 25-cent piece into a marvel of modern numismatic intrigue. In 1990, the U.S. Mint continued its standard production of Washington quarter dollar coins, a process so routine it unfolded with industrial confidence. The copper-nickel-clad quarters struck that year bore no commemorative features, no changes in composition, no revisions to the long-standing portrait of George Washington. The obverse still held the solemn gaze of the first president, framed by the words, "Liberty, in God we trust," and the date. The reverse displayed the familiar heraldic eagle with wings outstretched, talons gripping arrows and olive branches. These coins were never meant to surprise or astonish, they were produced to function, circulate, and be spent without a second thought. But somewhere along that unremarkable line of production, a mistake emerged, one that would only be recognized for its magnitude many years later. From the Philadelphia and Denver mints came hundreds of millions of these 1990 quarters. They were stacked, bagged, and delivered to banks and institutions nationwide. Yet hidden among the sea of identical coins, a few bore a secret, a silent deviation that even experienced eyes could miss if not examined closely. It would take years for anyone to notice that one quarter, among the countless others, was distinctly not what it seemed. The discovery didn't come with fanfare. It happened in a quiet garage, in the hands of someone who wasn't even looking for anything rare. Olivia Hartman, a retired librarian and weekend flea market enthusiast from Oregon, had taken up coin roll hunting as a way to stay sharp in her retirement. She would often exchange paper bills for coin rolls at her local bank, sort through them in the evenings, and replace them once she'd removed anything made of silver or pre-1982 copper. But in one roll of quarters from a dusty bank branch, she found something that made her stop mid-motion. The coin was lighter in her hand, slightly thinner. It had the same date, 1990, and the same portrait of Washington, but something about its color, its edge, and the sound it made when dropped on a table seemed wrong. She weighed it. It was under the standard 5.67 grams expected of a U.S. quarter. The reeded edge looked faint, and under a magnifying glass, the detail on both sides appeared unusually shallow. The texture was off, softer, less defined. At first, she wondered if it was fake, but her curiosity outweighed her suspicion. She placed it aside and took it to a local coin dealer the following week. The dealer's response was measured. "It wasn't counterfeit," he said. "It was genuine, struck by the U.S. Mint. But it wasn't struck on a quarter planchet. It had, most likely, been mistakenly struck on a foreign coin blank, perhaps intended for a South American or Caribbean coin the Mint was contracted to produce." The U.S. Mint, at various times in history, has struck coins for other nations, and blanks from those contracts occasionally ended up in domestic presses. These rare crossovers were almost impossible to detect unless a coin like Olivia's slipped through the cracks. Experts began examining her find. The planchet appeared to be from an aluminum-based foreign currency blank, far lighter than the usual copper-nickel clad. And yet the die used was standard for the 1990 U.S. quarter. It was a bizarre fusion of two worlds, an American design struck on foreign material. This combination, this unintentional overlap of projects, created a coin that technically shouldn't exist. News of the find rekindled interest in 1990 quarters, a year previously overlooked by most collectors. Forums began lighting up with questions. Could there be more of these foreign planchet errors from 1990? What other materials might have slipped through? People began weighing their quarters. Dealers started looking more closely at the reeded edges and fine details of coins they'd once tossed in bulk bins. Then came more discoveries, only a handful, but enough to confirm that Olivia's coin wasn't entirely alone. One surfaced in Florida, another in Arizona. All exhibited the same traits: underweight, off-metal planchets, yet bearing the full 1990 quarter design. Some appeared slightly off in diameter, others showed ghost-like lettering due to the softer surface of the foreign blanks. But each shared that same eerie presence, like a shadow of what a quarter was supposed to be. The value of these coins grew slowly at first, discussed only in the niche corners of error coin collecting. But as they were certified by major grading services and given formal designations, 1990 quarter struck on foreign planchet, their legitimacy was no longer in question. Collectors who specialized in mint errors saw them as holy grails of modern coinage, not just for their rarity, but for the story they told. They were accidents of process, the result of overlapping contracts, human oversight, and mechanical indifference. To the untrained eye, they still look like ordinary quarters. But they carry within them the story of a production line gone slightly out of step, where blank metal discs meant for another country were caught in the jaws of American dies and pressed into unintended history. They represent a moment when routine faltered and something extraordinary slipped through. Today, very few examples are known to exist. Most are hoarded by collectors, traded privately, or kept in vaults as part of high-end error collections. And with no official record of how many such coins may have been produced, or how many were unknowingly spent, they remain among the most mysterious finds of their era. Now, a 1990 U.S. Washington quarter mistakenly struck on a foreign planchet can command a staggering value on the collector's market. Depending on condition, material, and clarity of strike, these extraordinary errors have been valued between $36,000 and $98,000. In 1997, the U.S. Mint was operating with precision and momentum. The Washington quarter, a fixture of American currency since 1932, continued to roll off the presses in its standard copper-nickel-clad composition. These coins were not yet part of the revolutionary 50-state quarters program that would begin the following year, so their design remained unchanged: George Washington's resolute profile on the obverse, the heraldic eagle on the reverse. It was a year like many others in the world of coin production. Predictable. Ordinary. But as with so many great coin stories, buried within that normalcy was a single deviation, an accident of timing and metal that would remain undiscovered until long after it had escaped into circulation. The Denver and Philadelphia mints produced hundreds of millions of quarters that year, each meant to function as a simple medium of exchange. But in a batch from the Philadelphia Mint, something unexpected occurred. It was not immediately visible, not dramatic in any conventional sense, but enough to create a disruption in the coin's very identity. One particular error quietly took place at the intersection of technology and oversight. A coin struck correctly by design but fatally flawed by material, a planchet that didn't belong. Years later, in a modest coin shop in Des Moines, Iowa, a man named Edgar Klein, an unassuming collector with a habit of checking every coin he received as change, arrived with a pocketful of quarters and a question. He'd found one that looked odd. It felt smoother than normal, lighter, and under fluorescent light, it seemed to carry a slight golden tone not typical of standard copper-nickel coins. He had already weighed it with a digital scale, noting it came in slightly under 5.67 grams, the official weight of a Washington quarter. The dealer took a look and, almost dismissively, tossed it under a loop. But after a few seconds, he paused. The reeded edge was incomplete. The detail on the eagle's feathers looked muted. The strike was centered but shallow in parts, and the coin's edge had an unusually clean cut, more like a blank punched from thinner metal. What Edgar had unknowingly stumbled upon was a quarter struck on the wrong planchet, believed to be intended for a foreign coin. The U.S. Mint, during that time, had contracts to produce coins for various countries, and sometimes blanks would get mixed up in the feeding process. The coin bore all the correct 1997 Washington quarter design elements, but it had been struck on a thinner, non-standard metal disc. This wasn't a counterfeit. It was a genuine mint error, one that had quietly bypassed inspection and entered the economy without a trace. As word of Edgar's find spread, other collectors began revisiting their 1997 quarters. Not many surfaced, but a handful did, some showing weak strikes, others oddly colored, and a few with slightly smaller diameters. Each case revealed minor but meaningful differences: thinner planchets, softer metal compositions, and faint rims, suggesting they had not been struck on the robust clad metal used for quarters. The diversity of errors led to speculation. Some thought they had been struck on planchets meant for 5-cent coins from other nations. Others suggested they were leftover blanks from a test batch or produced during a transitional period between contracts. What united them all was their rarity. Unlike die errors or off-center strikes, planchet errors like these could only happen when an entirely different material was introduced into the minting process, either by accident or by a fluke in sorting systems. And given the efficiency of the mint's procedures, such errors were incredibly rare. Most foreign planchets were distinctly different in weight and composition, meaning they were typically caught during quality checks. But in a high-speed production environment, with thousands of blanks fed into machines every hour, one or two slipping through was always a possibility. The error's subtlety made it all the more compelling. It wasn't an error that jumped off the coin. It was one that demanded close inspection, weighing, and a deep knowledge of minting standards. As such, these coins became especially desirable to advanced collectors who appreciated the complexity and rarity of such anomalies. Coin grading agencies began to recognize them formally, labeling them as struck on wrong planchet or off-metal error, depending on the analysis. Even more intriguing was a twist that surfaced during an examination of one of these coins under X-ray fluorescence (XRF) testing. A 1997 quarter was found to contain an alloy not used in any known U.S. coin, something closer to an experimental foreign mixture. This discovery suggested the possibility that the planchet used might have been part of a test batch or sample stock for another nation's currency project, one never formally launched or publicly documented. The coin, then, wasn't just a misstrike, it was a relic of a parallel narrative in minting history, one where the U.S. was quietly preparing currency for another government or exploring new metal blends for future production. The revelation raised the coin's mystique significantly. It was no longer just an error, it was a question. What was this planchet originally meant for? What foreign contract might it have belonged to? How did it end up carrying the face of Washington? These were questions no one could answer with certainty, which only deepened the appeal for collectors who relished the unknown. Today, the 1997 Washington quarter struck on a foreign or experimental planchet stands as one of the more elusive and enigmatic mint errors of the late 20th century. While the standard 1997 quarter is still considered common and circulates widely, these rare misstruck variants have become the darlings of advanced numismatists and error specialists alike. Certified examples rarely change hands publicly, and when they do, it's often through private sales or auctions watched closely by elite collectors. And for a coin that once passed unnoticed through cash registers and jean pockets, the journey has been extraordinary. That once overlooked 1997 U.S. Washington quarter error coin now commands an astonishing value, ranging between $30,000 and $88,000.